Thinking about these feelings got me in my feelings, but I'ma be alright. Talk to them, there's no one to talk to, I just talk to you. Thinking about these feelings got me in my feelings.
Well, good day, everybody, and welcome to the New Jersey Psychological Association's Power of the Spoken Word podcast. Today, we're going to be doing our third installment for our book club. So I'm Dr. Daniel Lee, and this is the best place to get all the information you want on topics about New Jersey psychology and psychologists. Our podcasts are created as a resource for everyone who lives, loves, and works and plays in New Jersey. So today I'm joined by, I'm a Pete Economou, but we're going to call him Dr. Pete, as we move forward. And he is an associate professor at Rutgers University in the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology. He's also board certified in cognitive and behavior therapy. I am interested in a certified mental performance consultant. I definitely wanted to hear a little bit more about that. He's licensed in New Jersey and New York. Dr. Pete has a practice where he works with high performers at the collegiate and professional level, which included the National Hockey League, Major League sports, and also it looks like, is that Major League Soccer? Major League Soccer, and the National Football League. Dr. Pete is also a student of Zen Buddhism. He studied at the Morningstar Zendu with Robert Kennedy Arashi for several years, which has translated into, his mindfulness practices offered through the third wave of CBT theory. So, like I said, this is our third installment of our book club series. In these episodes, we will introduce you to an author and discuss how their book can influence your work with your clients and be a resource to the community at large. So we're going to be talking about today Dr. Pete's Mindfulness Workbook for Beginners, Exercises and Meditations to Relieve Stress, Find Joy, and Cultivate Gratitude. So I want to thank you for joining us, Dr. Pete. But also, your title says it all. I mean, we know that we're sort of recording this for our May's mental health sort of platform and theme. And we know everybody's been going through a ton of issues around COVID, the pandemic. So I'm going to sit there and just kind of catch us up to what motivated you to write such a timely book.
Well, I actually had been in communication with this publisher for a while. And mindfulness is a word that everyone has heard of. And it's interesting because about like 10 or 15 years ago, when I first started studying this, 15 years ago studying it, but then if I had clients coming, I'd be like, oh, this is how I approach therapy. And I would explain cognitive behavioral therapy, the third wave, and mindfulness. And people would be like, oh, that's interesting. Tell me more. Mm-hmm. These days they're coming, oh, because you're that person, like, or you're someone who does this thing that I'm looking for. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely become so much more mainstream, which is wonderful and can lead to opportunities for it to be misrepresented, underrepresented, or just kind of have some misleading beliefs, because there's still no magic wand. There's still the science and that like magic energy that occurs in the clinical relationship. Mm-hmm. So this book was like an opportunity. And so this book was an opportunity then to like break it down, because while everyone knows what mindfulness is, who's actually practicing it and like, what is it? Because all the books that were out there, and this is what I was intrigued by this publisher, are really like more advanced. Like there really was no, hey, this is the simplest way to do mindfulness.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I mean, so that was like a really interesting thing for me. So that was why I said, okay, this makes sense, and it was global, because I had talked to them about some more specific types books, because, you could Google and there's like mindfulness for anxiety, mindfulness for depression, mindfulness for substance use, there's all kind of specific things, but this was like, hey, here's just a general mindfulness thing. And Dr. Lee, one other thing I'll say is like, I think I have the luxury of working with people, in working with high performers. They're very healthy and very goal oriented. So they're just looking for improvement. Mm-hmm. And this fundamentally is just like a great opportunity to provide them with some foundation to build upon, which will inherently improve aspects of their life.
Gotcha. And I'm wondering, because I wanted to touch base on some points in your bio, and I'm wondering how they contributed to sort of the development of your book, particularly the Zen Buddhism, and the certified sort of mental performance consultant. So, I love talking to people where we learn quickly, like how we can diversify our skills. Like psychology is a good base to allow you to do other things. So how did those two sort of aspects of your sort of professional skill set connect to the book?
Well, I'll be candid, Dr. Lee. As I mentioned to you, I don't always like bios and and the CMPC I don't often include, frankly, and I sort of begrudgingly went for it. So that is through ASP, which is the Association of Applied Sports Psychology. Okay. And having been a high performing athlete myself, having studied intensely cognitive and behavioral therapy, and then to the point of board certification within it, and then also this kind of Zen Buddhist trajectory that I was on, I didn't feel like I wanted anything else. Like I didn't want another certification, but you're right. I mean, it is nice to repackage skills that we have. So I appreciate you saying that. And that's what led to my sort of begrudgingly approach to say, okay, let me do this ASP certification, especially as an academic. It's helpful, when you're developing and directing programs, which I do at Rutgers, one for performance psychology. So it just made sense. Where does it, but what it didn't add to my skill set.
Okay.
Because again, the board certification added, like I had to study, I had to do case presentation, I had to, I did have to take an exam for the CMPC, but the exam was just kind of based on like general sports psychology, kinesiology, things of that nature. So, and obviously, and I don't know if you want me to talk more about that, but the Zen Buddhism then clearly kind of links with the third wave CBT.
Because I was curious, particularly since you're talking about sort of the audience for your book and beginners, and I'm also thinking how mindfulness is like, creeping into everyday practices in sort of business and employment settings. So I'm in meetings now where grounding activities are like a norm, and sort of checking in with people like, oh, do a body break, do a mind break. Right. You're seeing all of these sort of aspects sort of kind of trickle in and sort of be acknowledged. So that's what made me think about sort of the beginner piece, but also your sort of how you're blending it with your skill set, because it is a huge need. So people, they're Googling like, okay, let's do breathing, or let's come up with another activity that we can sort of work in groups. So I guess that gets into, is there a particular passion you have around mindfulness? And if so, like kind of where did that come from?
Well, it is timely. So what I hear you saying is that, Silicon Valley, Fortune 500 companies, there's been several characters. Like I remember being at the American Psychological Association, and there would be some awards for like media awards for production companies or stations that were appropriately displaying or demonstrating what psychologists do. And now you've got characters in lots of different shows. And so in particular, there are several that are like in performance-based, like any listeners have seen Billions on Showtime. They'll see Wendy Rhodes and they'll understand that her performance aspect is all about how do I get these hedge fund guys to make good decisions, have clarity. And so I think I'm definitely more ethical than her. And
I watch Billions too, so I hope so. But there is an aspect of a reality to that where, that happens to be a lot of the clients that I work with. Like I do end up working also with a lot of finance, CFOs, CEOs, things of that nature, because you're right, it is there. So passion comes in that mindfulness is really born out of Zen Buddhism. Marsha Linehan, as she developed dialectical behavioral therapy, will now speak about the fact that A, she was highly suicidal and the most borderline person out there, so she claims, and B, that her journey in Buddhism is really what led to the relinquishing of her own suffering, which any Buddhist practitioner, as they would read dialectical behavioral therapy, would understand that's exactly where it comes from. Wise mind, that's middle path, and so all things radical acceptance, that's the first noble truth. All of us suffer. So a lot of those principles that are taught within that exist within the Zen Buddhist, traditions. And so what I find passion in is being able to, and frankly, I feel really lucky to be able to, is to sit with people through their suffering and really watch them and allow them to gain skills to relinquish it. And then be on this like path of growth.
which is just truly, truly remarkable.
That's kind of neat. You sort of been alluding to it, and I'm wondering if you can go a little bit deeper, like the sort of the basic premise of your book. Like, so, because I'm wondering with what you just described in terms of mindfulness, does that play out in the book? And if also, what should we as clinicians, we'll start there first. How should we be thinking about engaging with the book just based on its core premise?
Yeah, well, so the book, the way that it was that we discussed it and that we published it and went through the editing was that it was meant to be a hands-on manual. It's not meant to be read from cover to cover.
Gotcha.
And so like the first chapter has the most kind of teaching in it, but then every chapter thereafter focuses on an aspect of mindful living, such as compassion, gratitude, non-judgment, and then provides exercises for that. And again, I think that's what I felt really. It was almost kind of easy. There's always challenges and suffering and everything. But because these were exercises I'd been doing with clients for the last 15 years anyway, it was nice to kind of put them all in one place. So now it's a weird dynamic where some clients will find it or ask me like if there's a book that they should work with, and I'm like, oh, check this one out.
I have something.
But it has proven to be pretty effective and helpful. So I think people are finding it that way too.
Now, so what you just described, I just want to see if we can elevate for a second. So these are sort of strategies or interventions, mindfulness strategies that you've created over the years and you just packaged in one place?
That's right.
Oh, wow.
Well, and borrowed and properly cited. But so whatever it was sort of, yes, everything packaged in a place of all these different aspects of life. Because one of the things that I've always been very mindful of and has been an integral part to my clinical work is that we're more than just people. We're more than just athletes. We're more than just a hedge fund. Whatever our identity is, we're more than that person. And I find that with athletes whereby they're expected to be superhuman. So when they get pulled over for drunk driving, people are like, well, what's that? How does that happen? It's like, oh, right, because they're human.
Yes.
And so, or domestic violence, it's like, oh, because they're human. And,
yes.
There's no permission for that. It's just like that they also will make the same errors that the general population makes. And so that this was an opportunity to focus on, because mindfulness is not just about, it's a really value driven, and that's then borrowed from ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, from Miller, where we'd say like Hayes, or Stephen Hayes was like, or even Russ Harris, like a lot of those writings from acceptance and commitment therapy around everything we're doing is value driven. So in order for me to take my next step, I need to know what I'm stepping into and why I'm even taking that step. So if I am, let's say, in the MBA and I'm miserable, like, what is it about? Because everyone from the outside is like, well, you're making so much money, so that's great. It's like, well, sure, that doesn't like hurt, but then there's additional suffering that still is a part of that, because their mom still gets sick, or their wife gets sick, or their child has a learning disorder, so there's still things that they're managing. So, yes, maybe they have some money to manage it in a more effective or a different kind of way. But then with that, they have cousin Johnny coming to ask for money, and Aunt Sally, who's also interested in, a business opportunity. And so all of that, I mean, and I've worked with guys that, left a league with $10-15 million in the bank account, and then they're coming to me hardly being able to pay their mortgage, because that money, because the life skill that maybe they would have needed wasn't there for them.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's what I find really like compassionate and rewarding.
And as you're talking about this, I think one of the things that has been striking me in some of the sort of spaces and places I've been at is that the definition of high performers is broader than what people think. It's some of the everyday folks. So we talk about first responders, we're talking about teachers, we're talking about systems that I think people take for granted. And I think one of the pieces that I've been sort of elevating, and this kind of gets back into maybe another kind of question, is really thinking about everybody's talking about social emotional learning.
Yes.
And they're talking about how, before it was a fight, it was almost like it was separate from sort of our experiences. But really now when we think about emotional IQ, we're thinking about social emotional learning. Now, everybody understand that it's pretty much a both and, experience that people are struggling with. And I think that even goes back to the examples that you used, in terms of, we're human, you can't keep developing one part of yourself and neglecting the other. And I guess all of that to say is I'm thinking about, if we going back to when clients are looking for stuff and the public is looking for stuff, how should we approach this as clinicians if we're making a recommendation? Like, what should we be, what are the pieces that this book could offer, particularly if we're, all of us won't be working with athletes or these high performing folks, but we are dealing with people who are being stressed and having to perform at a higher level, particularly in this stressful sort of environment and space that we've been holding for about over a year at this point. So I'll be curious to see, what could we tell people about the book?
Yeah, I mean, one of the lines I like that that kind of just came to me as I was writing it was, you don't need, there's no fancy memberships or equipment needed. And because it's absolutely right. I mean, I work with all kinds of people too, right? I mean, obviously, my specialty is what it is, but this is for all people. And frankly, there's no one who wouldn't benefit from this. And so even with social emotional learning, SEL, that's mindfulness. Like that's exactly what it is just being emotionally intelligent, being aware of your peers, your environment, your insight. And that's all part of the mindful journey.
So before we get, I know we got a few more minutes, but before we get sort of the last sort of segment, I am wondering, what would you want someone to know about the book that they necessarily wouldn't get with sort of like a quick read, or if they just did the back cover or looked on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and got the summary? What would you want people to know if they had an opportunity to get to sort of pull it out and sit with it for a minute?
I mean, this book, the way that I have kind of pilot it with colleagues and friends, and also just seen it work, I think whether it's someone who's mandated to treatment for whatever their purpose is, somebody who has been in therapy for 10 years, first time in therapy, a mindful practitioner for the last 15 years, there's something in it for everybody. And so that sounds like a sales pitch, but it really truly does provide like the insight because one of the things we talk about within the mindful world in Zen Buddhism is the beginner's mind. Again, another, like, and any DBT folk would be familiar with that. That's a really Zen concept, is that each moment is a new opportunity. It's our first time in that moment. And so as we explore and enter that moment with the beginner's mind, we're able to see things more clearly, or we'll see something new. It's kind of like going into, I lived in New York City for a long time, and if I had friends visiting from somewhere, going around with them and seeing something that I hadn't seen before, even though I lived there or grew up there, right? That's exactly what this is. And so I think that this book would provide that for anybody.
Gotcha. So it's that thought of, just because it says beginner doesn't mean you're familiar with everything in it. So,
that's exactly right.
It's like, so that's a really good, because I think
so refreshing.
Yeah, because I think we're all, with this, and I'll be honest, I know I'm gonna use it just because everybody keeps asking me, can you do something? It's like, so I'm thinking you got enough to get me through a couple of meetings.
It's exactly.
So I ain't gotta create anything new. So I think that's,
well, and I will say that, Dr. Lee, that the one thing that I think is important for listeners, and just like traditional, say, psychoanalysis or psychodynamic training, where you have to have gone through your own analysis, I think this is harder to do when you don't have your own mindfulness practice. So absolutely, you can pull the book and be like, okay, let's start this meeting and let's do this exercise, or, body scan, grounding of the feet, 5 deep breaths. That anyone can do. And I just really encourage people to consider their own practice. And because that also has developed my enteric nervous system, right? That brain gut, the second brain, where I can sit with someone and just kind of know where they're at before the words start to come. And again, that's probably just being a psychologist and some of the things that we're learned and that comes over time. But I think in particular, when you're practicing mindfulness, you're able to really connect with that on a deeper level.
So that's something I didn't know until you just shared that, because I think the idea is how you exercising your own muscles.
That's exactly
right.
Working
with, kind of strengthening and building up someone else's muscles. And I agree with that. I tell folks all the time that I said, my clients can only go as far as I go.
That's right.
When I choose not to feel like, I guess, like you say, work through the struggle of my own personal growth and reflection, that's when I know I got to stop.
That's
Because
right.
it's like, I don't want to do anything else, which means I'm not going to connect or motivate anyone else to do
Right.
anything else. It's like the push won't be there, the curiosity, the energy. And I think that's okay, because I think we all have a lifespan with this word. I think it's
That's
only
right.
so much we can contain, manage, for any long period of time. But I do love the fact that you're equating that mindfulness needs to be a personal practice. And I think
Yes.
people take that for granted, because I think we just look at what we deploy,
Yeah.
let me give you this, let me teach you this, versus what's contained in me.
Right.
That I can use that as my own personal value to get you to sort of connect and invest and even model
And,
the power.
and I think it's critical, because I think it really brings up things that, I've even been surprised by. So like, as I'll do trainings on whatever the topic might be. And so like, if I do any kind of, anti-racist practices or something, I'll kind of I'll be able to feel in that moment what's appropriate. And it's allowed me to do some things that maybe I wouldn't have otherwise done. Like, all right, let's take a moment and think about your racial identity, to a room of white people, or, whatever it is, because that's all mindful, is to really think about all aspects of who we are, and how it affects us.
It's like, I know I'm wanting to move off, but you keep saying something that makes me add another thought.
Sorry.
And I think the one that got me was, it's this notion of sort of being aware or creating awareness of our intuitive self.
Yes.
And I think that a lot of people feel some, it's a whole lot of, like, a whole lot of different beliefs about that sort of gut feeling, or that sense of sort of presence that you have with yourself and with your clients. And I like the fact that you're honoring that, and that you're sort of talking to us as clinicians to say, find ways to get in touch with that more. So all of the things that don't get articulated can actually have a space.
Well, and I have another book coming out in June, but that one is
Okay.
a meditation journal for anxiety. So it's rarely, but I broke it down into mind, body, and spirit in particular, because it's exactly how I treat people. It's the approach that we take within mindfulness. And so we as clinicians have to also be in touch with our own spirituality and sense of self, because I think that's the biggest thing I've learned, that I feel I was taught wrong. I was taught, don't bring yourself into the room, wear a blank slate. So you come in and you don't bring yourself. And knowing what I know today, based on the human condition, mindfulness, Zen Buddhism, third wave CBT, all of me is in the room. I'm not overpowering the room. It's still their room, but every bit and piece of me is in that room.
I love it. I love it. And I agree with you. I wrote this one book, and we talked about the same thing, where it's the 4 parts of ourselves.
Yes.
And like you said, and we looked at spirit and soul, and however way you want to define it, in addition to your sort of emotional and physical space. And I agree with you 100% that the more we can be congruent and allow our clients to be congruent with all of those pieces, because those factors come up.
Yes.
And I think that we have to be integrated and allow ourselves to sort of tap into that. And I also think it's to honor and value it. That's what I keep hearing too. Honor and value that part of yourself. So we sort of kind of take it for granted. And sometimes I think we want to intellectualize it or rationalize it into a lot of things. But at the end of the day, it's just what you said. It's just that space, that spirit, that notion of you sort of, being present with this intuitive space that can allow you to be open and honest sort of with yourself and with your clients, hopefully, and create that movement that needs to happen. So this was really good. I don't know, we took that road, so I don't know, I hope y'all got it. But it was good to have that conversation, because I think it's something we take for granted, and it kind of gets into sort of our theme for like May is mental health. So we were talking about agile resilience, and it talks about the ability to bounce back. This is resilience from a negative experience, a difficult challenge, face a problem or challenge, overcome it, and get back to life a little bit stronger and a little bit wiser. We talked about agility. It's the ability to adapt and innovate by adding new practices to react to a crisis. And it's funny, because we were thinking about how when we were developing this theme for the association was the notion of how can we encourage our communities in New Jersey to start thinking about that ability to sort of bring forth some new practices, that sense of coming back a little stronger and a little wiser. And I guess it really ties into our last conversation, and you feel free to build on the thought any way you want, because part of that really is about being present with that kind of spacing yourself that might need to figure out how to get expressed and might understand what your needs are, but also what the needs are to folks in your community, your home, wherever you're at, and then having that ability to act on it. So I'm wondering, if we had to think about this notion of agile resilience, is there anything in your book that we could tap into, or just anything in general you would want to offer some of the listeners to think about how to just be stronger and wiser, through the suffering and struggles that we've had over this, I guess, year or so?
Well, over the beginning of time.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right.
Since the beginning of time. I mean, it's been heightened perhaps, but since the beginning of time. I mean, well, what I would say is flexibility. So what we find in third wave CBT and in mindfulness is that rigidity is what causes suffering. And so the more rigid I am in how I approach my world, the more suffering and pain I'll experience. Gotcha. So as we can have and cultivate flexibility, which occurs with the mindfulness practice, that changes the brain. It will change aspects of the brain, grow brain matter density. It will, change amygdala, hippocampus, things that regulate emotion, cultivate learning. So as we, so that would be the main thing. And the other thing I'll say about resilience is that I think one thing to be mindful of is even just reflect on our own resilience, because all of us are. And like I've read research where we think we're more resilient than we are. And I find that to be interesting only because it's not to say, it's not about a competition. It's simply about like, where am I at in this moment? And I need to understand, recognize that there are times when I'm stronger than others. And that if it's a moment where I can maybe benefit from some more flexibility to create resilience, then that's where I want to put my work. And that's where I want to put the effort.
I like that. It's almost like, use your strengths to grow even stronger.
Yeah.
So it's like, so if that's your growth edge, if you got the energy and the resources, take advantage of that space to say, where do I need to apply, some energy to sort of grow in an area. I like that. And I think that's a really good strategy and technique. So I was going to say, Dr. Pete, any closing thoughts before we go?
No, I mean, I think it was a pleasure. And I hope, again, what I would say also is that mindfulness is a self-care tool. I think right before COVID, we did a pretty large presentation based on that, where some of I brought in some of the neuroscience and the actual, the evidence of how much this stuff is helping us is enough to motivate us. Yes. And so no matter where you are, no matter what's going on in your world, I encourage you to consider developing your own practice, whether or not it's selfishly just for your own self-care and your own personal growth and well-being.
Well, I want to say thank you for your time, Dr. Pete. I'm hoping that you'll remember us when you make it big. So I want to speak that into your life and say, hey,
thank you.
I want it to work out for you. Yes, and I also want to tell everybody, this series is really about an opportunity to elevate sort of the work we do, the work our members do, and also resources for the community. So again, the book was Mindfulness Workbook for Beginners. Exercise and meditation to relieve stress, find joy, and cultivate gratitude. And I would add one more point for us as clinicians is to tap into our ability to be more intuitive and self-aware and trust ourselves in doing that. So we wish you well, and we'll see you on the next installment of the book club. All right,
thanks for having me.
Have a good day.
Disclaimer. This podcast is intended to provide members of the general public with access to information regarding the potential benefits of psychological treatment. This podcast is not intended as a referral service, an advertisement of services, or a solicitation of business, and is not intended to create a psychologist-patient relationship between any of the podcast participants and the listener. Any individual status as a participant on this podcast does not suggest recommendation of any such individual as a provider of services by NJPA or its affiliates. Thank you for listening to the NJPA Power of the Spoken Word podcast series. Remember that psychologists can provide meaningful insights to improve our understanding of things that matter in life. As experts in human emotions, behavior, and functioning, psychologists work with you to bring you the positive changes you want in your life. Be sure to visit the NJPA website at www.psychologynj.org and follow NJPA on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn.
Thinking about these feelings got me in my feelings, but I'ma be alright. Thinking about these feelings got me in my feelings.